Alright, so now we are on to the emergence of the United States in world affairs. So, up until this point in U.S. history, most of the United States activity had been really related to only the United States and its bordering areas. So, expansion into the West, expansion into the Gulf of Mexico, expansion into Cuba a little bit. Mostly that relates to the U.S., westward expansion, and the idea of manifest destiny going west until we hit the Pacific Ocean. Now we're going to see more evidence about how the U.S. leads itself into the world. So on the world stage, what does the U.S. start doing? And we're now a country that is a grand total of about 100 years old, so we're doing pretty well. 100 years later, now we're going into the world power sphere of things. All right, so first things first, we have to know what the key concept of this entire unit is, and that is called imperialism, which is kind of annoying because imperialism is spelled with an I, but empire is spelled with an E. It's just kind of annoying. I don't know why that bothers me, but it really bothers me. All right, essentially, it's when a stronger nation dominates an economically or sometimes politically weaker nation during the 19th century. So the U.S. was involved in a lot of imperialistic race to gain territories for natural resources and bases. European countries were dividing up the rest of the world. So the U.S. was out there just like France, Germany, England, all these other major countries who were dividing up and colonizing places. Now the U.S. is basically starting to also colonize as well for different reasons. And this is a very famous political cartoon from the time called Uncle Sam's One of the Boys, a quiet little game. Basically, it's just saying, hey, now the U.S., all of a sudden, we're at the game. We're playing cards with the rest of the nations about what portions of the world to take over. And here's a less well-drawn cartoon basically saying this is more about Africa. So the U.S. does not have a big influence in Africa during this time period, but all the other countries in Europe are just splitting off various portions and they're taking over. And we're going to see a quick map of what they actually looked like as far as the colonization of Africa by European powers. All right, so take a look at this, and you'll notice the U.S. is not in there. The U.S. did not take over any portions of Africa, to the best of my knowledge. But you'll even today, if you go to like Nigeria, if you go to French West Africa, it's called French West Africa for a reason. The French took it over, and there's a lot of people in Africa in these areas that still to this day speak French. Like in Nigeria, although it was owned by the British, also has a good French influence, so they actually speak Nigerian French. All these various places. In the probably the most notable one would be South Africa down here. South Africa, the language is English. The majority of people in South Africa are of South African origin, but there's also a very, very large white population that came there from England. All right, you can just pause it here, read some of the bubbles, just know what's going on around this time period, how we acquired Hawaii and various places, Guam, the Philippines. Gives you a good idea of the time. If you'll answer the two questions at the bottom, the geography skill builder, go ahead and work through that. Just pause it here and get through the assignment. All right, so there's three main reasons for American imperialism. We're only talking about American imperialism at this point. We're not talking about the rest of the world. Remember, this is U.S. history. First, a belief in a cultural superiority, that our culture was better. We need to spread our culture to other places. A desire for new markets, so the economic motivation, and a desire to increase military strength. Military bases, places like Hawaii, Pearl Harbor being probably the most famous. We need to expand outward to protect our various interests around the world. We need to have military bases to do that. Notice the amount of investment in foreign areas. Between 1869, very little, $100 million, which is a ton of money even by today's standards, but it's not that much when you think about what it was in 1897. So 30 years later, it is now all of a sudden 700,000. It's 7 times as much. Now, here's the crazy thing. So we went from 1869, then 30 years later, it went up 7 times. Now we're going to go to 1908. It's gone up to $2.5 billion. So we're talking about in 10 years, increase of quadruple. So it's an insane amount of just increase in spending because our goal at this point is to spread outward, go beyond the West, go beyond the frontier, and now we're going to expand around the world and expand our American influence around the world. Take a look at the imports and exports. So from 1870, very, very low importing and exporting, not a whole lot going on. But once you get to the 1900 year, right around here, it just skyrockets because we start colonizing, basically. We start having influence on the rest of the world, setting up bases where we can connect with people and ship things across the ocean. All right, one major influence, this kind of goes along with that cultural superiority kind of concept, is nationalism. It's pride in one's own country or nationality, or extreme nationalism, also called jingoism. It also causes nations to believe that they are superior to other nations, and therefore that they have a right to control the weaker nations. That's kind of just the way the thought process worked back then. If we are stronger, if we are better, we are allowed to take over. That whole idea, it's almost like has roots in that old idea of divine right, that, well, I got to this point, so now all of a sudden that means I can take over. Now, in the modern sense, we start seeing another concept come up that relates to just that national pride. Frederick Jackson Turner, he's a historian, he wrote about the closing of the western frontier. Basically, it caused the people in the U.S. to kind of go, well, we're done with our country. We need to expand outward. He basically coined the term, the significance of the frontier in American history, and he said, well, the frontier has been closed off. We're done. We've conquered all the land that is America, from North Carolina out east all the way to California out west. We're kind of done. What are we going to do now? Well, we go off to the next frontier, which is the world. And that was kind of a push to get people to have this idea of, well, we've taken over our country. Let's go over other places and take over those places, because we're a strong country, and the right of strong countries is to take over the weaker countries and make them strong and part of us. All right, so this is just a quick map of the closing American frontier, and you see these little time periods, and slowly we just kept going further and further west until we hit the Pacific Ocean, and there's just no more land to take over unless you want to go to Canada or Mexico, which we couldn't by treaty. All right, spheres of influence. A sphere of influence is a political science kind of term for territories or nations over which a nation exercises indirect control. So it'd be like, as a teacher, I have control of my classroom, but I might have a sphere of influence over another classroom next door if I'm trying to keep them on the same pace as us. So if we're at imperialism now, I'm trying to work with other teachers to make sure that their class is also with imperialism. Now, that doesn't mean I control their class directly, because their teacher does, but it means I have some kind of influence on where they are in the pacing of this course. So that's kind of how a sphere of influence works within the context of classroom. In the context of the world, it's when a country basically influences another country. They don't actually take full control, but they kind of like put their guy in charge and let the guy that likes them be in charge, so U.S. interests would be advanced. It happened a lot with Samoa and China in the late 1800s. All right, so here's some major spheres of influence during this time, and these still hold true today, guys. Like, there are portions, like if it went down a little further, French Indochina, we call that now Vietnam. That's where we're talking about. So in Vietnam, there's still people that speak French because of the French control and sphere of influence down there. Same thing with China, same thing with the Japanese and Korea. It's all very much, very, very long-standing spheres of influence to this day. Now, this blue cartoon says this is our sphere of influence. And notice there, obviously, the shadow is over the USA because, duh, that's our country. But the wings, they spread all the way from Washington, all the way from Cuba, which you can just barely see over here, down to the Philippines, which is way over here, and a little bit into Panama. These are all areas that were considered part of the quote-unquote American Empire because we were using our influence to basically control those areas of land, those countries. All right, take a look at Queen Victoria of England. All right, so these are all various leaders of the world during this time period, and it's a French cartoon, which is why it's spelled Chinese. That's the French spelling for China. Take a look at what's going on. There's Germany being really aggressive. There's Tsar Nicholas. He's kind of just eyeing something. Now, this is meant to make the French look really good because the French representation is right here, and she has no knife in her hand. She's not trying. She's just looking at stuff. Then you got, it's basically just the carving of China, and you have this very stereotypical Chinese person, meant to be kind of racist, up there trying to stop it, and he can't. And he has no power to stop it. Basically just illustrating the fact that all these European powers are basically taking over China, more or less against the will of the Chinese who were living there at the time. All right, Josiah Strong, very interesting character in history. So he's a minister, so we're talking about a religious person. He argued for an imperialist policy because he wanted people to go over to other countries and convert them to Christianity en masse. He basically wanted to go to these other places where heathens lived, although they lived there for hundreds of thousands of years, just fine without us, and convert them to Christianity based on Anglo-Saxon Christian supremacy. Again, this is that cultural supremacy argument, a little bit of nationalism in there too. So Anglo-Saxon, that means white English-speaking Christians. It was just another argument for imperialism. So it was kind of the first three things we talked about: cultural superiority, economic. Those are all fairly secular, meaning non-religious. This is now bringing religion into the fray and giving a religious justification for us going over and taking over various countries that are weaker politically and economically than we are. Now, here's a very famous cartoon. There's a phrase down the bottom that was very famous during this time period called the white man's burden. We'll talk a little more about that in just a second. The white man's burden was a phrase coined by Rudyard Kipling, and if you don't know who that is, he authored the Jungle Book. That should give you an idea of the time period and what the belief of less evolved, quote-unquote, evolved societies were and civilizations were in sub-Saharan Africa, China, those places. He had this belief that white Anglo-Saxon civilization had an obligation to civilize and help lesser people. So check it out. Now, this is the white man's burden in a negative sense. This is a very, okay, Rudyard Kipling made the white man's burden, but that was meant to bull crap. That's what this author's saying. The white man's burden is to be carried by these weaker people and basically saying we're basically enslaving them. Very negative. Now, here's a quick poem from this. This is, take up the white man's burden. Send forth ye best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. So we're talking about a very negative view of these other cultures and these other countries that are being taken over. We're treating them like they're basically children or evil. Like they're half evil and they're half children. So you got to baby them. You can't treat them like they're adults who can make their own decisions. We got to basically train them. That's the racist, jingoist, nationalist view of it. And that's what Rudyard Kipling was basically in favor of, although he was not everybody was. This is a positive, quote-unquote, positive view of the white man's burden, saying, hey, this is what our society and its greatness is doing. And you got somebody up here that looks a lot like Teddy Roosevelt, representing the U.S., carrying a very, very stereotypical tribesman from, I'm going to assume this is going to be somewhere in Africa, but you look at where he's walking up. He's walking up to the schoolhouse. He's taking this person who, quote-unquote, doesn't want to be educated because he's, half devil, half child, again, very racist, and he's taking him up to the school to go learn a very white Anglo-Saxon Christian education. So, again, racist, jingoist, very culturally negative nowadays. But back then, this would have been viewed as like being progressive. This would be like, oh my God, we're such good people. We're helping out all these sullen, sad people in these terrible countries. And take a look at what they're walking over. There's a pair of shoes down there. Well, guess what? They're not portraying this African guy with shoes. This is probably a dead American buried under the dirt. And you got someone saying May over here, and we'll talk more about that later on. But essentially, we're talking about a very racist, nationalist point of view back then that America and other white Anglo-Saxon European countries had a job to do, which was, one, to conquer the lesser people and bring them into civilization. A very, very, very Eurocentric, Anglo-centric. Today, of course, we look at this and go, oh my God, that's so racist. But again, back then, this was been like, ooh, we were such good people. We want to help people. That's how they would have looked at it back then. And here's the same thing, guys. Same exact kind of cartoon. And this guy right here represents the British. We got Uncle Sam here. We got the British equivalent up here. We're carrying all these Aboriginal people out of Hawaii and these various places out in Cuba, in the Caribbean, out in the Pacific. We're carrying all those societies up this mountain over oppression, ignorance, barbarism, vice, brutality, all these various boulders, all the way up to the goal of civilization. And again, very Eurocentric. But back then, they would have looked at this like, oh yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. We're sacrificing ourselves to make life better for these people. All the while, we're also engaging in warfare and killing them to get to this point. So this is all it's putting a very nice gloss over history of basically killing people and taking over foreign land. So not always terribly positive. Now, one of the biggest bases for this idea of our culture is better than yours, so we get to take you over, is a concept called social Darwinism. It's a philosophy that advocated survival of the fittest. So Charles Darwin kind of came up with that logic that with species, the strongest survive. Well, they start to apply that to how society works. And it basically created a justification, if you go back to our last unit, about people like Rockefeller. Well, Rockefeller's the strongest, therefore he gets to survive. It justified laissez-faire capitalism, and it was practiced used to justify imperialism. Well, our country's the strongest, we'll survive, and that means we're better. So we should go out and do these things because we have the right to do it because we are the strongest. That's social Darwinism. Not the greatest theory in the world. It's basically been debunked as being a valid theory. Playing right into this concept of social Darwinism is Anglo-Saxon superiority, this white Protestant feeling of superiority to other non-white nations. It was endorsed by most white Americans, not shocking, in the early 1900s, like Josiah Strong, as well as English citizen Rudyard Kipling. So we just talked about those two people, one being a very famous author. And here's another interesting guy, John Fiske, and this guy kind of explains where that white Anglo-Saxon, Eurocentric kind of point of view is coming from, and he kind of really explains it well. The work which the English race began in when it colonized North America is destined to go on until every land that is not already the seat of an old civilization shall become English in its language, in its religion, in political habits and traditions, and to be a predominant extent in the blood of its peoples. So, basically saying that unless it's a really old civilization like Japan during this time, like some places in the Middle East, unless it's a very old civilization, white folks are going to take over and teach everybody English, and that's going to be it. That's what he's basically saying. He's saying that it is our destiny, again, social Darwinism, Anglo-Saxon, Eurocentrism, going around saying unless there's a really old civilization already there, we're going to take it over, and it's going to be white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and that's how it's going to be because we're dominant. That's essentially how he's looking at it. That's how a lot of people looked at it back then, so it wasn't just him. All right, the missionary or moral diplomacy. This is something out of the Woodrow Wilson administration. Now, he was in office from 1913 to 1921. The reason for foreign policy to promote democracy and moral progress in the world, basically saying that, hey, look at all these sad people and they're not moral, they're not democratic. Well, we're going to take them over and make them happy in doing all those things. Wilson believed the U.S. should pressure Latin American nations to elect more democratic leaders and therefore should refuse to officially recognize any Latin American government it viewed as an oppressive or hostile to U.S. interests. This caused the U.S. to become involved in Mexican affairs in 1914-1916. So basically we were saying, well, we're not going to acknowledge you as a country unless you pick somebody we like to rule your country. That's democracy. Not really, because the idea is that self-government is democracy, so we shouldn't be influencing them. But it was a very common idea back in the day that, well, if we don't like you, we just pretend you won't exist, and then you'll be hurting because we are your neighbor and we're the dominant economic power in the area, and you'll be hurt by this. Now, here's the great cartoon about this political time period. All right, you got Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Mexico. These are Latin American countries during this time. This is like their children, again, infantilizing people, treating them like children when they're not. A very subtle form of racism. And look what's on the chalkboard. We can have no sympathy with those who seek to seize the power of government to advance their own personal interests or ambition. Well, that's what the U.S. is doing with this whole moral policy. They're saying we're going to use our power and influence to damage their country because we don't like what they're doing. Basically, we're doing exactly what this teacher is preaching that you shouldn't do. So it's a very strange, hypocritical argument being made here. All right, Pancho Villa, 1916. So Pancho Villa is a very, very almost mythical figure if you talk about like Mexican patriotism, and because he was basically fighting this idea of U.S. influence in Mexico. So again, this is where kind of historically, at least from the Mexican perspective, the U.S. is the bad guys. We're the bad guys. We're the imperialist power trying to take over their free country. And Pancho Villa was basically equivalent to a Rough Rider going across the borders and just pillaging towns. Now, he was hurting and killing people, so he's not a good guy. But basically, he's been glossed over by history and made to look pretty, at least from the Mexicans' perspective. And now this led to Woodrow Wilson sending a guy named John Pershing to pursue him. Basically, try to catch the guy that way, and catch him, prosecute him, probably execute him, all that stuff. And this nearly caused a war with Mexico because Pancho Villa was raiding towns in the U.S. So he was crossing the border. If he had been if he had been a Mexican officer, military person, it would have been an active war, no problem. But then our response was to send soldiers down south to go get this guy. That might have caused a war because you have U.S. troops crossing a border to go get somebody in Mexican territory. So you're dealing with a lot of geopolitical, almost wars happening kind of stuff during this time period. All right, and then we go to Seward's Folly. This is 1867, and this is right in the middle of Reconstruction after the Civil War. Now, we call it Seward's Folly, but that's not really fair because it wasn't really a folly. But at the time, they called it Seward's Folly because it looked so stupid. So when we bought Alaska, Seward, from Russia for $7.2 million. A lot of people felt like, oh my God, why do we do this? It's stupid. It's cold and dumb up there. There's nothing of value up there except for fish, which we can already access because we can get to the ports, and it's just a bunch of barren wasteland of nothingness. Until about 20 or so years later, in 1890, they found gold in the area. So Seward's folly turned into, oh crap, so that Seward guy made a good choice, and now we had a gold rush. So we basically bought it from Russia. Russia thought they got a great deal out of it because they were like, man, this is stupid territory. We don't need this. It's just a frozen wasteland. And we bought what we thought was a frozen wasteland, and then we found gold there. So yeah, that was a good deal for us. Although I doubt Mr. Seward knew at the time there'd be gold found later on. Oh, but on another thing about Alaska. So understand that just because imperialism, for the most part in this unit, we're going to be talking about guns going boom, bombs going off, and then taking over land. Imperialism during this time also took the place of, hey, we're going to buy this big hunk of land. Imperialism isn't always at the point of a gun. Sometimes it's with a checkbook, and they just take care of it that way. Excuse me. All right. So economic factors for imperialism. One big one you need to definitely know the definition of, forwards and backwards, inside and out, is mercantilism. If you had civics, you've probably had this mentioned once or twice. US 1, you definitely should have covered this. It's a pro-imperialist policy that holds that the nation should accumulate wealth by exporting more products than it imports. Many businesses at the end of the 19th century advocated this age-old policy. So this is an old policy kind of getting rehashed with this new era of imperialism. And essentially what we're talking about is the U.S. is saying we need to think places like Panama, places like the Philippines. The more places we own, we can sell our crap to them. And then that makes us more money because then they have to buy it from us. And that creates what we call a favorable balance of trade, which should be reviewed from when you took U.S. 1. All right, so into overseas markets. So this idea of mercantilism. The reason why mercantilism works so well for the U.S. during this time period is because we have a whole heck of a lot of land and not nearly enough people to deal with what we're making. Think about how much farmland there is in the U.S. We make so much grain, so much corn, so much wheat. We have more food being created than we can possibly consume. That makes us the perfect candidate to sell things to overseas markets. The problem is we're competing with other imperialist countries who will sell their stuff to their countries to make the most money. So we're thinking from the U.S. perspective, all right, if we acquire countries, acquire territories, we can use those territories to sell our product to them. That way we can make a lot of money. And that's the idea behind mercantilism and the favorable balance of trade I just talked about, all that stuff. So look at this chart, and you'll see that exports and imports were pretty on par with each other. They were pretty close. You saw a dip right around here during Reconstruction as far as imports because we were so poor in the South and there was a good portion of the population. Then they rise up. But here's the really goofy part. Imports have kind of leveled off right here. And then exports skyrocket right when we start engaging in imperialist behavior and taking over large swaths of territory out in the Pacific, in the in the Caribbean, and down towards Hawaii and Panama and the Philippines, all those areas. All right, so Alfred T. Mann. He wrote The Influence of Sea Power Upon History in 1890. To be a world power, the U.S. had to have a strong navy. This is the first guy that basically came out and said, you have to have a navy. Now, another person that was very influential in the U.S. Navy, as it turns out, doesn't give us credit for it, is John Adams. He always promoted a strong navy all the way back in 1780 when he was sitting there like, we need to build warships to have a strong navy because that's how empires get started. They have to sail places. Remember, the fast way to get from point A to point B during this time period was not airplanes because they didn't exist. It was ships. They were faster. You got around quicker. That was where power came from, was from the water, getting to point A to point B the fastest. And this guy kind of put that in writing and let the whole world know it. And he had a very big influence on U.S. naval policy and military policy during this time period, which was build as many ships, make as many ports as you can, and that will make us a strong country. And he wasn't wrong. And here's some military bases. These are just various quotes from Alfred T. Mann about sea power. At this point, they're steam-powered ships. Just take a pause, read this out, and you'll kind of understand where they're coming from as far as his argument that the sea is where we need to have most of the power, and that's how we're going to take care of things. All right, his book endorsed people like Theodore Roosevelt. When he became president, he supported a very large navy, at the time called the Great White Fleet, which was their new navy that came out. Like, we're going to build a whole bunch of boats, and they're going to go out there, and they were all painted white, which is why it's called the Great White Fleet. All right. All right, so check this out. This is just a quick map of what Teddy Roosevelt was doing during 1907 all the way up until 1909. Basically, he's trying to set things up where the fleet can ship around and go where they need to go. This is the route that you would follow if you were part of the Great White Fleet that would basically give the U.S. a lot of power in the ocean. Now, we'll talk about this little issue later on in the unit, but think about this. You had to go from here, from up in D.C., all the way down to Venezuela, around to Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. When the Panama Canal is constructed, we cut this off. We can go from here to through here, and then we're done. So we'll talk about the Panama Canal later on. All right. The U.S. expanding its influence. So this is the time period we're talking about where we start taking over Hawaii. That's 1898. Nicaragua. We start influencing that area. The Panama Canal Zone in 1903. Huge, huge, huge area of U.S. influence because it does so much for U.S. trade. The Haitian Revolution. All these various places. Take a look through this. You'll just so many different places that we exercise influence over during this time period.